All right, so we're going to get started. I'm Jim Nakashima. I'm joined here by Saurabh Bhatia.
Hey, good morning, everyone.
And we're both program managers on the Visual Studio team. On that team, actually our job is to design and build the developer tools that you all use, or hopefully will use soon, to build apps for Office and SharePoint. In this session, the key goal, or the key thing that we want you to get out of it, is a real concrete understanding of apps for Office and SharePoint. You've seen a lot of slides, you've seen some demos and things like that. We're going to bring it down to code, do a lot of demos, and use these demos to actually make this really concrete for you. Now, we know that you all extend Office and SharePoint today, and I want to reassure you that the existing technologies that you use to extend Office and SharePoint will continue to be supported for the foreseeable future. However, this session is about this new apps model. And we'll go through this model by first talking about apps for Office. Then we'll talk about apps for SharePoint and dive in there. We'll show how the model is actually unified and composable by building an Office-enabled app for SharePoint, which is essentially an app for SharePoint that has within it an app for Office. And then we'll round things out with some hosting and publishing. So my goal for this talk, actually for me personally, is actually to talk as little as possible so that Saurabh can spend more time doing demos. That said, I do want to make sure that we're level set on some key pieces of information and that you have some of the context that we think is important for the demos to land well on the top of your head. So you've seen all this information yesterday, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. The first is that it's a unified app model between Office and SharePoint. And we haven't done that before, as you guys know. But you've always been building solutions which cross-cut Office and SharePoint and Azure and web. Finally, we've actually brought together an app model that respects that makes it easier for you to do that. And web standards base. You've heard this over and over again, I'm sure, but I just want to reiterate again, and I'm going to say it probably 5-6 times in this session, that, hey, it's just web development. Our demos will show you how it's just web development. So you can leverage web developer skills to build these apps for Office. With that, let's dive into apps for Office. So talking first about some of the app shapes. Task pane, content, and mail. So a task pane app sits next to the document, and the canonical example really is the dictionary app for Office, where that dictionary app sitting in the task pane can actually interact with that document. Then there are content apps, and these actually sit in the body of the document, so it's like dynamic content. And here's an example of Excel, where we actually have a Bubbles visualizer that visualizes data in Excel, built as an app for Office. And Saurabh is actually going to build this today, starting from new project, ending with a Bubbles visualizer inside of Excel. Finally, for apps for Office, we have mail apps, which are inline panes on an email and appointment item. I always think of the UPS tracking example of having tracking information right in your email. But another good example is from LiquidSpace, where it actually sees that in the mail, it's contextual. So it says, oh, I see something like meet at Thursday at 2, so I'm actually going to activate this mail app. And it can suggest meeting rooms for that meeting, essentially, based on the content of the mail. All these apps are actually available on the Office store today. So every app that I show in kind of a demo, not demo rather, but in these screenshots are actually available on the store. So with that kind of what you can build, let's now talk about how you build it and what the anatomy of this app for Office is. So at the bottom are Office applications. I'll use Excel as the example, but it really does apply to all the Office applications that support apps, Word, PowerPoint, Project, and so on. So Excel at the bottom is an Office application. Your end users are using it. They go out to the Office store, and from Excel shows in product a set of apps that you can add essentially to a document. When the user clicks to add app ABC, for example, Excel gets back manifest information. Now, it doesn't actually get back the manifest itself, but it gets the information from the manifest that you as a developer provided by authoring that XML file. One of the pieces of information that that app manifests is a URL to a web server. And so Excel goes out to that web server and brings back a web page. That web page is hosted in Excel in a embedded IE control, essentially. And that web page can, in turn, interact with the document by using an Office JavaScript OM, object model or library. And that, together, brings up an app for Office. So with that context setting, let's now turn it over to Saurabh, who's going to show you how to get started and build your first app for Office.
Thanks, Jim. Let me just flip it over here. So, in case you haven't heard already, if you're a developer developing apps for Office or SharePoint, the one site you want to go to is dev.office.com. It's the developer dashboard for building these apps for Office and SharePoint with lots of documentation, some neat videos out there, and most importantly, out there you can go in and sign up and get an Office 365 developer site. Now this developer site is much like any other SharePoint site, but with the key difference that it allows you to side load your apps. What that means is you can debug against this O365 site right from your box, right? So once you get this subscription, you will also get access to our Napa tools. What's Napa? It's the easiest way to get started to start building these Office apps and SharePoint apps right in your browser. And in case you're wondering, it is a code name. It kind of came from Jim's love for the Napa wine country, I guess. So not the official name, but that's what we are calling Napa for now. So once you've signed up, and that's kind of what I have done out here, this is my developer site, and I can launch Napa by just clicking on this Build an App link. The first time in, you'll actually be redirected to the SharePoint Marketplace to install Napa onto your dev site. Because Napa itself is an app. It's an app for SharePoint that lets you build more apps for SharePoint, right? So I've already installed it, so I'll just click Build an App. And since I have it, it's going to take me directly to Napa. And right up front, since I haven't created any projects, it's going to ask me what type of app I want to create. We support creating all kinds of apps right here in Napa, including apps for SharePoint and the 3 app types that Jim talked about for Office, the task pane, content, and mail apps. So for the first app, let's select content right here. I'll just give it a name, my first app. Let's call it my first content app, and hit create. When that happens, we actually create this project for you right there, and it has some sample code in the project already. You'll notice on the right there's an HTML page, there's an editor with some code highlighting in there. We'll look at the capabilities of the editor and what the code does in a minute. On the left there's JavaScript files, it's kind of your solution explorer, some images, and some CSS files. But what I'm going to do first is I'm actually going to hit this run button right over here. And when I do that, we will actually package all this source that's up in your Napa project into a SharePoint app and sideload it onto your dev site. And since this is an Excel content app, we'll actually use the Excel web app that's on the SharePoint site to load up a blank workbook. And I guess I have to log in again. Sorry. I have to just log in because I was trying this out and I deleted all cookies. So let's say keep me signed in. Oh. Maybe not. Let's try it again. There you go. So this is my Excel web app on my SharePoint site, and it's loaded up with an app inside it. And this is the sample app that you get when you just do a file new project. So right, without installing anything, right in your browser, I just had to log into my O365 site. I'm able to create a project, run it, and in the browser itself, see the output of it. I can use my browser tools right here because it's all HTML and JavaScript to even debug the app. So no tools required. You can just sign up and get started in building these apps. Now, let's look at what this app does. It's a very simple app. It's kind of getting started scenario. It kind of shows you what capabilities simple capabilities the Office app model has. It's got set data, which is going to write data from the app, which is a web page, to the document. If I have data in the document, say my data, I can hit the Get Data button and read that back. So this is one of the simpler capabilities that the Office app model allows. Now, as I said, this little white square here is actually just HTML JavaScript. It's just a website, right? And it can talk to the Office document. It can also talk to anything else out there. It can talk to web APIs that are out there. It can reuse existing JavaScript libraries that are out there. So this new app model is really great at creating some interesting mashup scenarios where you have data in your document which you can extend by, say, pulling additional information for the data from an existing web service, and then maybe even for Excel content apps, create interesting visualizations with the huge number of JavaScript libraries that are out there. So as Jim mentioned before, he showed you the bubbles example. What we can do now is we can actually take this sample and extend it so that it'll read stock symbol data that's in the spreadsheet. It'll read those symbols in. Then it'll query a stock API service, stock REST service that will get the actual stock price, and then visualize it all nicely in the bubbles visualization, right? So let's see how we can build that. Now, to build the bubbles visualization, I'm going to use an existing JavaScript library called processing.js. It's got a bunch of visualizations. Here's an example of what we'll be building. This is the bubbles visualization, just a sample out there. It's actually looking through Spanish text in some book, and it's creating bubbles for letters that occur together. The more occurrences of those letters together, the larger the bubble. So we kind of use the same principle, but with stock prices now, where the larger the stock price, the larger the bubble. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I actually want to download processing.js. I could download it from here. I've already done that, so I will kind of go back to my site here, and let me close that up. What I'll do is I have my demo helpers here. That's my processing.js library. Let me snap that. And I can just drag and drop my file right in the browser there, and it's going to upload it. Now, if this JS file was available as a CDN location, I didn't have to upload it to my project to be part of my code, but it's not, so I'm just uploading it to my project. I also need this text file which defines the bubbles and the colors that they're going to use. So, all right, I have updated my project to include the processing.js library. Now I can kind of start updating the source code, the HTML that's in there. Let's take a look at what's in there actually. There's a script source which is just pointing to the jQuery CDN location. jQuery is just a nice library to use for anything you're doing in JavaScript, so we'll be using that. There's also a reference to office.js, which is the Office JavaScript object model, which lets you access those APIs that can read and write from the document. Right? Now I'll just add a script source to this new library that I just added, which was under scripts processing-1.0.0.js. And as I'm typing, you'll notice the editor is actually smart enough to kind of complete the script tag for me and do some nice things there. So I'll also go ahead and update the little visual content I had there with the set get data and the text box. I don't need the set data button. All I want to do is I want to read data from the workbook, so I'll get rid of the set data. It's Control/, another shortcut in the editor to comment stuff out. I don't need the text box anymore because I'm not going to be writing to a text box. I'm going to be visualizing those bubbles. So for that, what I'll do is I'll actually copy-paste some code here, which is essentially a div which has the canvas that'll show the bubbles on that web page. So I've updated my HTML page now, and now I need to go in and update the JavaScript, which will actually do the work of querying the stock price and displaying the bubbles. So for that, I have my app.js file, and it already has the sample code in there, which was doing the get and set data functions. And this is using the Office API. The most important one is actually this Office initialize function. And all it really is you can think of it as your app startup function. When the Office app loads up, when it's ready to interact with the Office document, this function occurs, and you can hook up all your event handlers in this function and so forth. So that's kind of what I'm doing here with the get data button and the set data button. Now, initially, the get data and set data were hooked up to this text box. I don't need the text box anymore, so I'll just use Control-H, which gives me this nice find and replace, which will replace all my code. I also don't need the set data actually, so let me just delete that line using some more shortcuts and delete that out too. I do need the get data, but I need to update it so that it can actually read multiple cells. I was initially reading only one line of text. I want to actually read multiple symbols that are in the Excel spreadsheet. So what I'll do is I will change this coercion type from text to matrix. This is the Office API. It supports multiple types of data structures, text, tables, matrix. So I'll use matrix over here. And to store the value of the bubbles, I will actually also define a global variable called values over here, which is an array which will contain the stock prices. Now, in the get selected data async function, I also have a callback. Since this is an async function, it triggers, it tries to get the data, and then it'll have a callback when the read data succeeds. And this is where I can check whether the read was successful and what the values were. Right now, it's just writing those values back to the text box. I need to change it so that whatever values I get back from the workbook, I use those to query a stock API service to get the stock price. Now, I'll be using Yahoo API. I'll just pull up some code here so that I don't have to write it all up. What I'm doing here is using Yahoo's YQL API to essentially take the result of what I got from the Office document and query its yahoo.finance.quotes table to get the actual stock price of the stock symbols. Right? So it's standard API. You can go look it up on Yahoo YQL, and you can go try it out yourself. There's many APIs out there. The only reason I chose to use this is because it doesn't require a dev key, so I can share it with all you guys right over here. Right? It does have a downside, though. It has an upper limit of how many times you can use it. I think it's based on an IP address, so it might just be that it might not let me in because I've been using it a lot to try this out. So as a backup, what I've done is I've actually I check whether the query result that I get from Yahoo is greater than 0. If it's not, I'm going to use some cached values of the stock price so that I can populate it with those cached values. And I have these cached values from last night. So just in case the Yahoo service doesn't want to let me access the real-time data, I have this fallback of cached values that I want to use. Now, the last thing I'm actually doing here is calling a show canvas function. This is called when I read the data from the Yahoo service, it succeeds or it falls back to the cached values. I actually want to populate these bubbles with the right size based on the price of the stock symbol. So let me define the show canvas function. I can again use some shortcuts in the editor to use a functional snippet. Let's say that and call it show canvas. I don't need these parameters. And let me copy paste some of the show canvas code here. All this is really doing is setting up the canvas to use the processing.js and mapping it to the bubbles visualization that we saw earlier with the example of those letters. Right, so that's pretty much it. I've changed the HTML, I've changed the JavaScript to call into this API, and then whatever results I get, I'm going to visualize them in the bubbles visualization. When I hit run now, we should be seeing something different. We should actually be seeing just one button there with the get data function. It'll still open up the Excel workbook. And I'm hoping the network is actually fast enough to actually upload the file. Oh, it is. Good. So the Excel web app is loading up again. And I can start. So there's the get data button, just one button. I got rid of everything else on the HTML page. I'll start typing in some values here. Let's say Microsoft, Yahoo, because we are using their stock, and let's just say Facebook. Now I can just select this and then hit the Get Data button. And sure enough, it actually gave me the live values. So this is live values from the actual stock price values that are happening right now. So this actually goes to show the point that this is web technology and it's live data, right? So it's inside your Excel workbook, but it can update real time because it can query some other web service and get real live data. So we kind of went through a lot of code very quickly, and what I kind of want to do next is kind of let you have the opportunity to go look at the code that I just wrote in front of you. And to do that, I'll just hit this Share Project button right here in Napa and click on the Share button. And what that will do is create a copy. Let me just zoom in over here. So it created a shared copy of this project. And if you go to this URL, and Jim's going to have another version of it shortly, but if you go there right now, or maybe later, you can actually view the source code that I just wrote right over here. And you don't need a Napa account or O365 account to view the source code, but if you do have a Napa account, then you can copy this over to your dev site and run it and try it out and extend this code. Right? So this is a great way to kind of share your knowledge about the new app model, about APIs, or even get debugging help. You no longer have to just share code snippets and ask everyone to copy paste it in their VS. You can just share a project and get them to try it out on their tenant and get some dev help. So that's a nice way of kind of making development more social, sharing more, right?
Thanks, Rob. Hey, I noticed you were using these shortcuts, and you kind of mentioned a few of them, but it wasn't terribly obvious to me how you might know to actually use.
That's a good point. So lots of shortcuts out there, but the most important one to remember is actually Control, comma, and that gives you a bunch of these shortcuts right in the editor, so you can go try them out yourself. The editor is quite powerful, so you can you do get a lot of shortcuts out there to increase your productivity while you're writing the code. So Control, comma is kind of the way to get started.
Yeah, and you know what? We're going to do work to surface this functionality better to you when you're in this editor. But for now, this is actually a great tidbit of hidden knowledge that you can share on a blog post or a tweet or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So,
and
anyway.
you know what? Actually, one more thing I wanted to just point out is we also have this give feedback button. So in case you find out some of these shortcuts are odd, or if you really want an additional shortcut or some editor capabilities, or anything else in Napa for that matter, once you sign up, you actually have this get feedback button here, which lets you send us feedback directly to the product team. So if you have any feedback, you can go use it and send it us directly.
Yeah, and it literally does come to us. We literally get all the feedback directly.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
All right, so here's the other link to the Bubbles project. It's a little bit cleaned up. We also added a couple comments and things. So in case you wanted a better version than the one that was just authored in front of you, there it is. And again, you can browse the source code. In order to run it, you do need to get one of these O365 developer sites. Another couple key takeaways from this session. You saw Saurabh use HTML, JavaScript. You saw him use a open source processing JS library. You also saw him use the Yahoo Stock Ticker API, YQL. All web standards, right? It's just web development. So got to say that. Going to say that again and again and again. The other thing to point out is just the way that we got started, right? We're so accustomed as developers to actually go and install a bunch of software on our dev boxes to actually go and give building something a try. We've tried to make that a lot easier for you by just saying, hey, sign up for an account, get this dev site to work again, so you got some tools in the cloud, give it a try, and when you're ready to go, open it up and continue in Visual Studio, and we'll show you that in a little bit. All right, so that concludes the Apps for Office section. Let's now dive into Apps for SharePoint and get you from 0 to 60 on Apps for SharePoint. So unlike the app shapes for Office, which were different, you might build an app, mail app, or you might build a content app or a task pane app. App shapes for SharePoint are slightly different in that most certainly you're going to build a full page app, and then you may add on, as accompaniments to that full page app, parts or UI command extensions. So a full page app literally takes over the whole page when you click on the tile. You can cite contents, click on the app, it takes over the whole page. And that's actually what you saw with Napa. But here's another example in the store from AdLib. It's an AdLib PDF publisher. It actually goes and talks to document libraries, so you can select multiple documents in the document library and then have it output a single PDF document. And you can see there that it took over the whole page. We've also made it real easy in the tooling for you to get the Chrome at the top and the look and feel of SharePoint. Then there are parts. Hey, this is a SharePoint conference. You guys all know about parts and adding parts to pages, right? And I'm showing a world, clock, and weather, which is on the Office store again, that has a part that you can put on any page. That said, the thing you may not realize is that adding parts is slightly different than what you're used to. I mean, not really that different, but it actually is contained in its own button. So it's under the app parts instead of web parts. And so it is a native part of this new app model. Then there are UI command extensions. So the little pop-ups, pop-ups that you see in SharePoint 2013, as well as extending the ribbon. And here's an example from the Nintex Workflow app that adds a timeline ribbon tab, for example. So let's now talk about the anatomy of a SharePoint hosted app. So yesterday in the keynote, you actually saw cloud-hosted apps, and there was two types of those. There was the type where SharePoint would create the web server for you and manage the deployment to the web server, rather. And then there was the case where you would actually provide your own, and Scott Guthrie actually showed you using Azure for your own web server. We're going to start with even a simpler model called SharePoint hosted. Now, it is more limited, so we actually do think the cloud-hosted model will be more common. But in order to land some of the things that we want to land here, we think it'll be easier to start with the SharePoint hosted app. So similar to Excel, and you're going to see this unification coming into play here, SharePoint goes off to the store, and it gets back. So you go all site contents, add an app. Shows you a list of apps, a SharePoint store, and it shows you a list of apps that you can add. When you go and add an app, it brings back manifest and, in this case, code information, code files that will actually then be hosted on SharePoint. That code then provides, when you click into the app, the UI and the implementation for that app for SharePoint. The code in this case is limited client-side code. And what I mean by client-side code is literally code that's downloaded to the browser and executed there, not on the SharePoint server. So JavaScript, CSS, HTML, and the client-side portions of ASPX. So why is it limited to that? Well, one of the tenets of this new app model has been to make find, try, buy easy and not impactful. So if an end user wanted to find, try, and buy 1,000 apps, if those apps were then hosted on SharePoint and had server code, well, you're going to bog down the SharePoint server. Similarly for Office, if we had a startup time impact for every app you installed, well, that wouldn't be good. So a tenet really was to avoid those situations. And so in the case of SharePoint hosted, it really meant limiting to only client-side code, because that will run in the browser. Now, of course, client-side code is a big limitation. We know that. And so we will talk about the cloud-hosted model later. But let's talk first about this SharePoint hosted model. And to show you an app that you can build using that model is back to Saurabh.
All right, thanks, Jim. Cool, so I'm back in my Napa site here, and that's the first project I created. This is my project page. I can go in and select a new project now, and this time I'm going to create a SharePoint project. So let's just say my first SharePoint app. And sure enough, Napa will once again create a project for me with some sample code that's already in the project. Now, we're creating a SharePoint hosted app here. So even though you'll see this, it says ASPX, this really is client-side ASPX, which means it can be hosted directly on the SharePoint server. What it also means is you can use some SharePoint-specific ASP.NET directives. So the couple of lines at the top over here, these are those ASP.NET SharePoint-specific directives. And what these particular ones do is they add a little Chrome bar at the top, which makes your app look and feel like it's just like part of SharePoint. If you remember, SharePoint has this little breadcrumb and toolbar at the top. So this will add that. It also brings in some CSS so that you get all the styles. They just flow through your app, and your app can just take advantage of the SharePoint theme. So in the content section, there's again a link to jQuery because it's awesome and it makes JavaScript so much easier. There's not much content here. There's just a paragraph, and it just has an ID message which says initializing. And the comment here says is when the app loads up, the initializing text will get replaced by the username of the current user that's using the application. So let's look at how that happens in the JavaScript. That's my app.js. And again, I'm kind of using the SharePoint JavaScript object model here. I continue to use the document ready object because this is just web development. So this is jQuery's DOM ready event that occurs when the HTML page has loaded all the DOM elements. At that point, I'll make a call to SharePoint and say, hey, SharePoint, get me the current context. That's what I'm doing with the SharePoint ready. Get me the current context, the current web. And when I get those things, it finally says get username. And if that query is an async query, again, is successful, it'll replace that message paragraph that we saw earlier with the initializing text with the text hello, and then user.getTitle, which happens to be the SharePoint object model to get the user's display name. All right, so let's see what happens when I run this. Once again, we kind of package this all up into a SharePoint app and go against your same dev site that we were using earlier. But this time, since this is just a SharePoint app, we'll just directly load up the browser. We won't have to use the Excel web app. So there you go. It's a full-page SharePoint app, so it's loading up. And if you notice, the hello was initializing, and then it changed to the hello as SharePoint loaded up. The stuff at the top is the Chrome control that automatically got added. It gives you a link back to the dev site. So these are the ASP.NET directives that added these links in. So a very simple kind of Hello World project, which shows you how you can use essentially the SharePoint OM to access your username. Now, we can extend this in a similar way that we did with the Office app by calling another web API and hooking it up with some data that we got from the SharePoint site. Right? So we got the username from the SharePoint site. And what we'll do now is actually I'll take the username and call Flickr and search for all public pictures that are tagged with that username, which in this case happens to be me. So let's see how we can do that. So I already have my onGetUsername success field, which happens when I get the username from SharePoint. I'll just change that to say search Flickr for, and then keep it the same. It'll show me my username. And I'll define another function here called getFlickrData and pass it the username, which happens to be user.getTitle. All right, now I need to actually define the getFlickrData function. I can use snippets again. That's the function, getFlickrData. I do have a parameter this time, which happens to be username. And for the call itself, I'll actually just copy paste some code right here, which makes a call out to Flickr, checks for all pictures tagged with my username, and then whatever results it gets back, it's going to put it back in that message div as an image HTML. So again, very simple code using some jQuery to query Yahoo's Flickr service. Flickr, once again, was a choice because it's open, doesn't require a dev key, right? So, all right, let's see what happens when I run this. This time around, actually, it shouldn't install the app. You'll just see it uploading it and launch the app directly. So we're actually smart enough to say, you just change 2 files, so we'll just upload those 2 files and show you the app. And that's the picture. It's the exact same app, but it actually went to Flickr and pulled that picture of me. So that's the Flickr app showing you how you can use SharePoint with web APIs.
Thanks, Rob. So again, so here's a URL actually for the shared project for that Flickr app if you want to go out and get the source code for it. A couple key takeaways while you jot that down. Again, just web development. We use Flickr APIs. You saw the use of JavaScript there. You saw, well, not standard web development, but ASPX as well. The other thing is just highlighting again, we've changed the model a little bit. Get started by signing up for one of these dev sites. And actually, what you'll see is as a Visual Studio developer as well, you're going to want one of these dev sites. As you can see that Napa and Visual Studio support remotely developing against this site. Okay, so let's now talk about Office-enabled apps for SharePoint. And this really kind of shows or highlights how this is a unified model that is composable as well. And by composable, what I really mean is that you can have an app for SharePoint where in a document library, the documents in a document library that's a part of that app for SharePoint, in that document library, all the documents actually have an app for Office. And so I like to use the example of a plagiarism app. So you could have an app for SharePoint that takes a document library and surfs over all the documents in that document library and runs a plagiarism analysis on each of the documents. Then when you open each one of the documents, you could actually get the individual results for each one of those documents, for that plagiarism review, in an app for Office in that document, in a task pane, for example. So from a developer standpoint, what does that mean? What do you actually do to enable that? Well, you have your app for SharePoint, actually just like the one that Saurabh just showed. You add a document library to it. You add, or you create a document or a template that contains an app for Office, and you set the default content type for that document library to be that document or template. So to continue to build upon this Flickr app that Saurabh just showed you, we're now going to make it into an Office-enabled app for SharePoint.
All right, so I am back in Napa, right where we were with the Flickr app. I had just written this code and ran it. You saw the SharePoint app load up with my picture on it. Now we want to make this app an Office-enabled SharePoint app. So how do we go about doing that? So what I'm actually going to do now, we've been in Napa so far, but Jim's already alluded to it, that you can open this project up in VS. So I'll just hit this button, open in VS, and it'll prompt me to download this exe. And this exe is nothing but a bootstrapper, which will, when you run it, it'll check whether you have all the right prerequisites and install them if you don't. In this machine, I already have them. So the project that I had on Napa, I can just bring it down to Visual Studio by hitting that button and then continue developing on it in Visual Studio. So Napa is a great getting started experience. You can just sign up and kind of write your first prototype app. But when then you're ready to grow up, you want to do some serious stuff, you can just bring that project up in Visual Studio. Right? So here's the same app that I have in Visual Studio. You can see there, if I open up the app.js, it's got the exact same Flickr code that we just wrote. So now I want to extend this so that it's an Office-enabled app. And to do this, I need to do 4 things, kind of like what Jim mentioned. I need to add an Office app to the SharePoint app. I need to add a document library to the SharePoint app, which includes as its default content type the Office document that has the Office app. Then what we'll do is we'll actually reuse the exact same code that we wrote for Flickr in SharePoint, but now host it inside an Office application and show you the exact same code running inside the Office application. And then finally, since it's an Office application, extend it so that when you click on that image, it'll use some Office-specific APIs to write to the document. Right? So let's see how we can go about doing that. In VS, I will just right-click. I need to first add an Office app to the SharePoint app. I'll just add a new item. And I can choose Office app. So let's call it Office Flickr app. And when I do that, VS will actually prompt me, what kind of app do you want to add? Task pane, content. I'm actually going to select a task pane app. And by default, you can actually build these apps that target all Office applications. You can build the single app that works in Word, Excel, or PowerPoint. I'm actually going to be using specific APIs to Word, so I will actually uncheck both those and just say Word. When I hit Next, there's an option I get over here which says, do you want to have a new document that uses this app, or do you want to use an existing document? So if I had like a document template with some content in it that I wanted to add this app to, I could have done that with an existing app. But for now, I'm just going to say create new document. And now VS will actually go in and to my SharePoint app project, add a bunch of code files and another manifest file for the Office app itself. And here's the JavaScript that got added. And you'll notice it looks very familiar to the one we saw earlier with the Bubbles app. It's got the same set and get data functions. It's kind of doing the same sample code thing that we saw earlier. And we'll get in and change that a little bit. But now that I've added the Office app, I want to now add a document library to the SharePoint app, which will host the Office document that I just created. So once again, I go add new item. This time I'll choose a list. I'll call it a doc lib. And VS will prompt me what kind of list I want to make. So I'm going to select document library, hit next. And even over here, I actually get an option right in the wizard to say, I want to use a specific document as the default content type for my list that I'm creating. And over here, I'll select the Office Flickr app document that I created earlier. All right, I hit next and click finish. Now VS will go ahead and add all the right SharePoint artifacts to add the list to it and make the make the Office app the default content type. Now this list that I'm adding is actually scoped to the app. It's not something that gets added to the site. It's when you add an app to a site, you automatically get this list as part of the app. So only the app has access to this list. Now, to access this list in code, I can actually just directly use this relative URL from the app code, which is list/doclib, to directly view the default list view that SharePoint provides. If you want, you can use the SharePoint JavaScript object model to customize the view, but I'm just going to use the default view, so I'll just have a link on my SharePoint start page to the default link view. So let's do that. Here's my default.aspx page that I had, which had the message initializing function, which gets replaced by my picture. I'm just going to add a href to /. Oh, well. Let's see. That's why we're still calling it Preview 2, by the way. Well, while I give it some minute to complete, I also have this backup, luckily. So I'm going to open up the default.aspx page here, which already has the exact same link in there. So let's use that. So I've added this exact same link here. The next thing I actually want to do is refactor some of the code I had in the SharePoint app and make it so that I can use it inside the Office application. So my SharePoint app had app.js. Oh, sorry, this is the refactored code already. So, oh, well, this instance is back up, so I will add it here so that we can actually build the demo. View doc library. All right, I added the link. Here's the app that we had, which isn't refactored. So what I'll do is I'll just copy this, which happens to be the only SharePoint-specific part for this entire JavaScript sample that we had. And I'll copy the rest, and hopefully VS will work. OK, good. And add a new JavaScript file in here. And let's just call it lib.js. Right, so I can now use this library in both the SharePoint app as well as the Office app. Now, since I changed these references, I'm going to actually refactor. I'm going to add a reference to the lib.js in the default.aspx page as well as the Office app that HTML page that we have. So to do that, let's add lib.js over here. So my SharePoint app is now updated to work with the refactored code. I can now move on to the Office app HTML page and kind of do the exact same thing over here. Now you'll note this HTML page looks very similar to the very first sample app we built. It has a reference to the office.js file. It has a reference to its own JavaScript file. It has some content in there. So to update it, the first thing I want to do is add a reference to that lib.js. Now, I also want to actually make this work with Office and SharePoint. So I also need to access the SharePoint JavaScript object model here. It has a link to Office JavaScript object model, but I need to add a SharePoint JS link, which, again, I will copy-paste. And that worked. And you'll note it's just a link to SharePoint runtime.js and a link to SharePoint.js. Very similar to how Office.js works. Finally, I'll update the content. I don't need the get data, set data buttons anymore. I actually need it to be exactly the same as the SharePoint message initializing function so that I see the exact same content which says searching Flickr and the list of all images down there. So that should pretty much be it. I've updated my HTML page. The last thing I want to do now is update the JavaScript, make sure that it calls into the same SharePoint APIs to get the username, and then do the last additional step to make it Office-specific so that when I click on the image, it actually inserts that thing into the Word document. So here's the JS file for the Office app. I'll remove that. I'll call the SharePoint ready function, which calls the Flickr service. And I will do some jQuery magic here, which will add a click handler to all images that get inserted into the message paragraph. So this works dynamically, essentially. Even if the image is added after the page is loaded, it still has a delegate click handler so that we can then call the set data function, which will write the data to the document. Right, so I've added the click handler. Now I need to go update the set data function. It doesn't take element ID. Now instead it takes a source, which happens to be the image source of the Flickr image. I wrap that up in some HTML, and then the one update I need to make is there's this Office-specific function, which is set selected data async. It was previously just setting some text value. I can change this to the image HTML that I just defined up there. And I can also define since this is no longer text, it's HTML, I need to define a coercion type of HTML. And let me complete that bracket there. That should be it. So, made a lot of changes here, but it's essentially showing you that I'm reusing the exact same code I had in SharePoint in Office. The lib.js was totally unmodified. All right, let's hit run. When I hit run now, VS is actually still going to talk back to the same Office 365 site that we were using on Napa, right? So I still don't have, SharePoint on this machine. I'm still doing remote development. It looks like I'm running into some issues here, so let's just switch back to the backup copy I had. And let's run that. It's the exact same code, but it should go faster. It'll load up the page. And now you'll notice that this is the link to the document list. When I click on that, this is the default library view that you get by simply linking to the list/doclib. Any list that you add will be on that location based on the name of the list. Now, since the content type I've specified for this list is that Office app document, I can just click New, doclib content type, and it's going to prompt me to open up Word with an Office app in there. So I believe I already have a Word document. That's open. Let's go ahead. So this is the exact same document. Let me hit refresh over here so you guys can see it coming in. Ooh, if Word decides to respond. Nope. Well, you can actually see the image there. Essentially, it's running the exact same code that we had up there and showing it to you inside the Word document. And you'll have to take my word on it that if I clicked on it, it would have inserted it in the document. So, little demo trouble there, but
okay. Hey, thanks a lot.
Enabled.
Saurabh? So let's switch back here. A couple cool things that I noticed in this in the demo, though. One is it was really easy to share code between the app for Office and app for SharePoint, and inherently built upon the same model, which I think, as you all build these cross-cutting solutions across Office and SharePoint, we'll come to appreciate. One of the other things to mention is really that we made it really easy to move between Napa and Visual Studio. So I wanted to take a minute to actually talk about that and talk about how we think about Napa and Visual Studio. We're from the Visual Studio team, so we're not like, saying, hey, use Napa, don't use Visual Studio. And we know you're all pretty much, especially a conference like this, you are all Visual Studio developers. So how do we think about Napa and Visual Studio? Well, one of the key points to Napa is you didn't need to install anything. And, without installing anything, you actually ran an app for Office. You actually ran and built an app for SharePoint. And we think that's compelling for certain scenarios, right, if you're getting started. So one of the things that we think about in terms of Napa and Visual Studio is get started in Napa, continue in Visual Studio. And we invested quite a bit. So you saw that button, Open Visual Studio. Well, it went by pretty quickly, but that's actually a pretty big investment because one of the things that we actually do there, if you're new to app development, is we launch the web platform installer, and if you have Visual Studio 2012, we'll get you the add-in to Visual Studio 2012 that you need in order to actually use Visual Studio to build apps for Office and SharePoint. So one click, seamless, everything comes down, you get what you need, we open the project, and away you go. Let's now talk about cloud-hosted apps for SharePoint. And we've talked about this anatomy of a SharePoint-hosted app, and it's being really simple. So the provider-hosted app is what you saw in the keynote, where you actually have a web server as well. Now, that web server could be on Azure. It could be one on-prem if you want. You could actually have one from a different provider. It doesn't even have to be a Microsoft stack. All it needs to be is a web server. And in this case, SharePoint still gets the manifest information and SharePoint artifact information from the Office Store or App Catalog. But in this case, all the implementation, essentially, of what you see in the browser comes down from your web server. So with that, we're actually going to show another demo. What we've seen so far, and what you saw yesterday, has always been starting in Visual Studio, new app for Office, new app for SharePoint, and that happens to include a web project. We actually want to turn that around a little bit and really show you how this really is just web development by starting with two different types of web projects in Visual Studio. The first type of web project we're going to start with is an ASP.NET MVC4 web project, just a standard one. And we'll show how you can either turn that into an app for SharePoint or add an app for SharePoint and reuse that same project for not only as an entry point to your app for SharePoint, but also as an entry point for your web application as well. Second type of app that we're going to show is a light switch app. And light switch makes it really easy for you to build data-centric line of business applications. So we'll show an app there that's built in light switch, and it's just a web app. A light switch app is just a web app, and we'll turn that into an app for SharePoint. Again, what you get through the benefit of making it an app for SharePoint is you get to surface your app where your users are. They're at your SharePoint portal, their company's SharePoint portal, and you can surface your app there. Additionally, you get auth and identity from that SharePoint portal, so you don't even have to worry about implementing that separately in your own app. So with that, we're going to turn it over here to Saurabh, who's going to show you turning a website into an app for SharePoint.
All right. Thanks, Jim, for that additional time while I fixed my machine, or at least tried to. So let's hope this one goes better. So here I have a simple MVC app. It's actually just a brand new MVC app, just to keep things simple. It's got the standard MVC internet application, the simple models, account model, some home, about, contact views. You can actually imagine this could be your existing website, whether it's ASP.NET or MVC. And you can just convert it to a SharePoint app by right-clicking on it and saying, Add App for SharePoint Project. The only question it asks you now is, what's your dev site that you want to debug this app against? I'm going to continue using my same O365 dev site that I had earlier. And when I hit Finish, VS will actually add the second project to the solution. And the second project is nothing but a manifest which will install on the SharePoint side, and this manifest points to the MVC application that you had running. So you could get to kind of the same experience from a File New project, but you could very easily just start off with an existing project and make it a SharePoint app project. When I hit Run on this now, instead of just launching MVC, it'll actually install the app on the same SharePoint server and load up the exact same thing, but now through SharePoint. So let's see if this goes through. Maybe. So this is actually making a round trip all the way to O365, and depends on the connectivity that you have. The advantage is you don't have to have SharePoint locally, but then you need to have a good connection in order for this to work.
Yeah, it's always nerve-wracking doing cloud demos because you're at the mercy of the network and there's a million devices in the room. Let's see.
Maybe not, so I'll just skip that. I'll actually show you just switch over to the next one. The idea really with the app is it's very easy to go from any existing web application, make it a SharePoint app, and just get it running right there inside SharePoint. You still debug it using the same VS technologies, so when you hit F5 on that SharePoint app and you launch it, it's still being hosted on localhost, but the entry point was through the SharePoint site. Now, I have this light switch application over here. And light switch, as Jim mentioned, is like a really easy way to get started with building data-centric modern apps. This particular example is actually a survey application where you have a food delivery company that has salespeople out there in the field, and this is built using HTML and JavaScript. And it's actually really touch-friendly, so you can actually just load it up on any device, tablet, or whatever you have out in the field. You can, it's nice and finger-friendly. But this is just a website at this moment. And what you can do is you can convert it to a SharePoint app by going back. So this is a light switch project. By going to the properties, and there's an Enable SharePoint button out there. And when I hit that, it's again going to use it against the same dev site I've been using throughout, which has been giving me trouble at times. But when I hit F5 now, hopefully this one will go quicker. Let's see. Maybe not. Let's try that again real quick. So what we do with the light switch application is we essentially add the Chrome control and the SharePoint auth to the application. So initially you just had one web app that you had to figure out how your end users in the field are going to access. But by making it a SharePoint app, you can use your SharePoint identity and access management even for all the other light switch applications. And that really was the key to converting an existing website and making it SharePoint and accessing it through a SharePoint site.
Yeah, and the thing that we wanted to show here, and it's unfortunate this is happening. Actually, if we wait long enough, I'm actually pretty positive it will install. But yeah. the key message to land here is, it was just a couple button clicks in both the app project types where you actually were able to change it, and then hit F5. And literally, it will work at some point. For the light switch app, it actually even adds a Chrome control at the top for you, as Rob was mentioning. Is it going?
There
it's
it
going!
All right. So same app, but now it was launched through SharePoint, and it's still being debugged on localhost. And you'll note it's this exact same thing, but there's this Chrome control at the top, which when I hit on will take you back to your dev site. So now it's just really part of the SharePoint site.
Great, thank you. Woo! All right. So now that we've actually talked about apps for Office, apps for SharePoint, Office-enabled apps for SharePoint, we've talked about provider-hosted, we can now talk about how Napa is an app for SharePoint. So we use the same cloud app model that we've been talking about at this conference to build Napa. So it works the way that you would expect. So we start, in the case of Napa, on the SharePoint developer site. Go to the Office store, install the Napa app. We're a provider-hosted app, so all the install entails is actually getting the manifest information to that SharePoint developer site. A piece of that information is the URL where Napa is actually running. And that URL happens to be napacloudapp.com. And that URL is from Windows Azure. So Napa is actually an ASP.NET MVC4 project running on Windows Azure. And we deploy it ourselves, so it's a provider-hosted app. In Napa, we allow you to build or author client-side code to build apps. Apps for SharePoint, apps for Office, and we use the SharePoint developer site as a host. So we have, as tooling, we actually have the ability to sideload apps onto the developer site, meaning not going through a store or app catalog, but doing a developer version of it. And when you click on the tile, or actually what we do during the run experience is actually bring up another browser window pointing to that app that was just sideloaded onto that SharePoint developer site. Additionally, as you saw early in the presentation, is the ability to build an app for Office and show the app for Office running in an Excel web app, or it could actually be in one of the rich clients as well. So how do we do that? Well, what we do is when you're actually building an app for Office using Napa, you actually focus just on your app for Office. In the background, we actually use this composable model to create an app for SharePoint, a document library, and a document. You never see it, but we build it for you in the background. Then we deploy that app for SharePoint, or the Office-enabled app for SharePoint, to that SharePoint developer site. And then we ask SharePoint to load up that document in the Excel web app or in the rich clients, and so on. So you focus on your app for Office, we do all the packaging, and we run it. But the thing that I really like about this is it really shows how flexible this model is and composable the model is. And so that's how Napa works. With that, let's now talk about publishing. So you've built some apps, you're a developer, and you want to get them out to your end user. And there are two ways that you can actually do this. The first, you're all going to be familiar with if you've built any app for any store, including Windows 8, Windows Phone 8, and now the Office and SharePoint stores, which is you submit your app to some kind of dev center. It gets onto the Office store. End users can find, try, and buy from the store. In this case, the store for Office and SharePoint is integrated into the Office and SharePoint applications. Then they go and try it, and they use it, and everybody's happy. The other way was highly influenced by our corporate and enterprise customers, where they wanted to go directly to vendors or their own in-house teams to build their own apps that aren't available on the Office store and have an IT admin actually manage the deployment of those apps for their end users. So we created an app catalog. SharePoint, it's actually just a list on SharePoint that also allows end users to get apps in Office and SharePoint. Finally, the IT admin can go and find, try, and buy apps from the Office store and bring them into their corporate app catalog. So there's total governance over their apps by an IT admin. And we think about the two scenarios as the store scenario and the app catalog scenario. So to talk about publishing, I want to actually now recap the different hosting models that we've looked at. So the first one for SharePoint was the SharePoint hosted app. Very simple, client-side code only. Manifest and code information comes from the store app catalog. So if you right-click and publish in Visual Studio on this type of app, you're going to get an output that is a single .app file. That .app file you give to the app catalog or the store, and it gets downloaded, or the information actually gets brought down into SharePoint when a user installs the app. For a provider-hosted app, this is the kind that I actually run my own web server. I have to manage the deployment to that web server myself. And we call this provider-hosted. It has a web server. It has a SharePoint component. And in this case, you actually get primarily, you see a number of files here, but you actually primarily get a .app and a .web file. The .app file is the SharePoint app package. That goes off to the store, to the app catalog, and contains SharePoint artifacts, contains manifest information. The code, the implementation of the website, actually is in the .web package, and that's a web deploy package. You can use standard web deploy tools to actually deploy that off to any web server that you want. Well, IIS in this case because it's web deploy. But you really manage two things out as part of deployment. Finally, what you saw in the keynote yesterday was where SharePoint actually managed the deployment of the web app. And to hammer this home, you can see that if I publish an auto-hosted app, where the Azure website is managed by SharePoint and not by you, you again get a single app package. In this case, there is a .web package, but that .web is actually inside this .app. And then SharePoint knows how to split those out, put one on an Azure SharePoint instance, and the other part of that, give it to the store, the app catalog. So the next session, actually right after this, at I believe it's 10:30, is actually put on by a couple of teammates of ours that also work on Visual Studio. They're going to go in deeper on apps for SharePoint specifically, and the Visual Studio tooling that we have. So what we thought we'd do for publishing, because they're actually going to show the full publish, they're going to go in the package and all that kind of information, we thought we'd actually go back to Napa and just show the complete end-to-end experience of deploying to an app catalog from Napa. Again, if you want to see the Visual Studio version, which actually, quite honestly, isn't much different, the next session will cover that. So with that, Saurabh?
All right. Thanks, Jim. So I am back in Napa now with the project that had last worked, the Flickr app. And what we'll do is now actually publish this out. This is a SharePoint-hosted app. We'll publish this out to an app catalog and see what the experience is like to install the app to the app catalog and then get it from the app catalog to the end user's dev site. So here's my app. In Napa, we now have a publish function, which literally came up last Friday. If you were an existing user, this is new for you. When I hit that, there's a couple of options here. Specify a version number. I'll just keep it at 1.0.0. I'll choose to create a public link. And this is actually using SharePoint's sharing functionality, also something I guess Jeff Teeper showed you on the keynote there. But why this is important is when I create this package, I want to install it to the app catalog. I'm the dev. I might not have access to the app catalog. Only an IT admin may have access, right? So you could just share this link with the admin, and then they could go get the package and install it in the app catalog. You don't have to kind of send them a file. So that's why I just selected that. So let me hit publish, and when I hit publish, Napa will actually create this .app package, and it has created this public link for me. I can copy this over, send it to the admin, or I can, in this case, I happen to have admin rights, so I'll just save this file on disk. That's great, I have saved it. Now I can actually go to the app catalog, and this is the app catalog that I have created for my dev site. And I have options to actually add apps for SharePoint or apps for Office. This was the Flickr app for SharePoint, so I'll click on the app for SharePoint. I already have a Flickr app in there, just as a backup, but let's add this new app that I just created. This is something that admins would go through usually. I believe I put it inside Downloads, my first SP app. That's the app. It's just another list, so it's kind of the same UI as adding a list. So there, I've added my app to the SharePoint app catalog. Now this should be available to anyone who is using a site associated with that app catalog. So end users, they can always go to site contents and say add an app, and this is how you install any app. You could go to the SharePoint store to get apps from the marketplace, but this one is from the app catalog, so I'm going to say from your organization. And sure enough, I have my first SP app that shows up there because I just added it. I can click on it, say I trust it, and now it'll add the app to my actual site itself. And this should also be fairly quick. Let's give it a quick refresh. There you go. It's added the app, my first SP app, and when I launch it, it's the exact same app that we saw earlier when we were debugging. So it's the exact same app, and luckily no one else has tagged me on Flickr yet. So it's still one image, but you'll notice it's actually being hosted on the SharePoint site itself. So that's a SharePoint hosted SharePoint app that we just published through Napa.
Thanks, Rob. So we're kind of getting into the last part of the session here. We have just a couple minutes left. Do hope that, again, kind of going back to the beginning, we really wanted to make sure that we made apps for Office and SharePoint really concrete from a developer standpoint. We showed you a number of demos that hopefully did accomplish that. And just to highlight the tooling that we have available, Napa, Visual Studio. We've invested a lot in that, and we hope that you find it really useful. And we know that is, Visual Studio in particular, is where you live. And so we want to give you an opportunity to influence your home. And so we are going to have some focus groups this week, tomorrow and Thursday, as well as future research opportunities for you to give us feedback. So you can influence future versions of Napa, of Visual Studio, and in return also get a complimentary gift. So how do you do that? Well, go and register at the Visual Studio booth in the exhibition hall. Capacity is limited. So please register early, but we would love to get your feedback, love to make Napa and Visual Studio better for you. Finally, a couple of resources. The main one to remember is really dev.office.com, although we have a pretty good and vibrant apps for Office and SharePoint blog as well. And finally, always asked to say this, to fill out an evaluation. We really hope that you found this session interesting, helpful, useful, and so on. And if you did, please do. Here's the link. Here's where you go and evaluate the session. If you didn't, I will point out that evaluations are not mandatory. So just in case. But anyway, in all seriousness, please do fill out an eval. Really hope that you found this session useful. And we really enjoyed being here today and presenting to you. And hope you have a great rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.